She returned a lost wallet. No questions asked, no reward expected. But what she didn't know was that the owner wasn't just a stranger. He was a millionaire, a man hiding behind walls of wealth and power. What happens next will change both their lives forever. Trust me, you won't believe the twist at the end. The cold air of a Chicago evening cut through Ella Johnson as she stepped out of the bookstore. The snow had started falling again, delicate flakes swirling in the wind, blanketing the city in a layer of white. The light from the street lamps flickered softly, casting long shadows across the sidewalk. It was the kind of cold that made you feel small, insignificant, yet oddly beautiful. Everything in the city seemed quieter under the weight of the snow, as if time itself was slowing down to catch its breath. Ella had spent another exhausting day behind the counter, surrounded by the familiar scent of aged paper and the hum of customers quietly browsing. She loved the bookstore, but after 10 hours of stacking shelves, ringing up purchases and offering polite smiles, her body felt worn, like a well-used machine that had finally run out of steam. The bus ride home would be long and the walk even longer, but this was her routine, one she had grown used to, even if it left her feeling empty at the end of each day. The weight of her life, her responsibilities, her constant fight to keep her head above water often seemed unbearable. Ella was a single mother, doing her best to provide for her young daughter, Lucy, but the financial struggles never seemed to let up. Bills piled up in her inbox, the rent was always due, and each day she spent at the bookstore was another reminder of how much more she wished she could give her child. But the hours were long, and the pay was barely enough to cover the basics. Still, she carried on. She had to. There was no choice. As she walked down the snowy street, her tired legs carrying her with effort, her phone buzzed in her pocket. It was a message from Jamie, her younger brother, a text she'd come to rely on for the comfort it brought. His messages, simple as they were, always reminded her that she wasn't alone in this world. "Did you eat dinner yet? And don't tell me it's instant noodles again." Ella smiled despite herself. Her brother had a knack for cutting through the exhaustion, making her feel like someone cared. "I'm good. Sandwiches." "What about you?" she typed, her fingers numb from the cold as she pulled her coat tighter around her body. The response came almost immediately. "I had a sandwich too, sort of counts, right?" Ella couldn't help but laugh, shaking her head. "That's not real food, Jamie." "You're not my mom," he teased back. She rolled her eyes, smiling despite the tiredness in her body. "Just be careful. Don't take the shortcut through 9th Street, it's getting dark," she warned. "I'll be fine," he replied. "It's faster and my feet are killing me." "Okay, but just be careful, all right?" she added, a familiar maternal concern slipping into her words. She heard the sound of traffic growing louder as she walked, the world around her buzzing with activity, but it all felt so far away, like she was walking through a fog. The streetlights cast soft yellow glows on the icy sidewalks, and she watched the snow swirl in the wind as if the world itself were holding its breath. Ella glanced up at the sky, the last traces of sunlight disappearing, leaving behind a wash of orange and lavender. The air felt thick with something unspoken, like a pause before the world moved forward. Another long shift was behind her, and she was no closer to the things she wanted. Peace, stability, a life that didn't feel like an uphill battle. The familiar sounds of the city, honking horns, shuffling feet, the clatter of the occasional car passing by, faded into the background, and all she could hear was the crunch of snow under her boots. She had walked this path countless times, each step leading her further into a life she wasn't sure she recognized anymore. The dream of being something more than a single mother working multiple jobs was slipping further away with each passing day. She had tried to keep it all together, but at times it felt like she was losing herself piece by piece. As she turned onto a quieter side street, her thoughts were interrupted by a small object on the ground, a black leather wallet half concealed by a crumpled newspaper. She paused, her breath visible in the cold air. It was strange the way it caught her attention. In the midst of her own world, the simplicity of the object seemed to stand out. She looked around. No one else was on the street. No joggers, no pedestrians, just the thickening silence of the evening. It was as if the world had forgotten about this tiny, lost item. Cautiously, Ella bent down and picked it up. The leather was smooth, expensive looking, and as she opened it, she felt a jolt. Cash. Lots of it. Stacks of neatly folded bills, 50s, 100s, laid inside the wallet. She pulled out a black credit card, the kind that only the ultra-wealthy could afford. It shimmered in the dim light. And then she saw the ID Ethan Blake. The name lingered in her mind, almost familiar. Blake. She frowned, trying to place it, but nothing came to mind. There was a business card tucked behind the ID, Blake Tech, with an address in Midtown. She exhaled slowly, the weight of the wallet in her hand suddenly feeling heavier than its contents. The idea of keeping even a fraction of the money felt tempting. After all, who would know? No one would ever suspect her. She was invisible to the world most of the time, just another face in the crowd. But Ella wasn't that kind of person. She had been here before, standing at a crossroads, feeling the pull of temptation. She had learned time and time again that the right choice didn't always bring immediate rewards. It didn't always feel satisfying or fair, but it was the right choice. Not who I am, she muttered quietly to herself, her fingers tightening around the wallet. She wasn't naive. She knew how tempting it could be to take what wasn't hers, especially when life seemed so unfair. But even as she thought about it, the weight of her decision became clearer. She would return it. She would do the right thing because it was who she was. There was a moment of hesitation, of doubt. She thought about the bills inside the wallet, the possibilities they represented, but then she forced herself to breathe deeply. The decision had already been made, even before she found it. It wasn't about being noticed for doing good. It was about being able to look herself in the mirror tomorrow and still feel like she had stayed true to herself. With a quiet sigh, Ella tucked the wallet into her bag and began walking again, a little faster now, as though she was trying to outrun the doubts that threatened to creep in. The night was settling in around her, and she felt the weight of it. The weight of the world that always seemed to be asking for something more from her. But tonight, at least, she had given the world something it hadn't expected. A moment of honesty, a simple act of decency. She didn't know it yet, but this small act would change everything. The snow continued to fall as she made her way home, the city stretching before her, a world that felt as cold and distant as it ever had. But something inside her had shifted, just a little, just enough. It wasn't much, but maybe, just maybe, it was the beginning of something better. The morning after she had returned the wallet to Blake Tech, Ella felt an unusual heaviness in her chest. She had tried to put it out of her mind, to let the act of kindness speak for itself without any expectations. Yet despite her best efforts, a small part of her was waiting for something, anything, to show that her actions hadn't been in vain. Maybe she had hoped for a simple thank you, or some acknowledgement of the effort she'd made to do the right thing, even though the world often seemed indifferent to such things. But instead she had received nothing but a cold, impersonal email and a few $1,000s that she had promptly tossed away. It had left her with an odd mix of satisfaction and bitterness. She had done what was right, but in return all she had gotten was silence. The email from Blake Tech hadn't felt like a reward. It had felt more like a transaction. The response was brief, mechanical, with no hint of warmth or human connection. There had been no curiosity about her, no inquiry into who she was or why she had gone out of her way to return a wallet she could have easily kept. It was simply a message instructing her to deliver the item to their Midtown office. And so when Ella sat at her kitchen table the next morning, staring at her laptop screen, she found herself wondering if it was all worth it. Was doing the right thing ever truly appreciated, or was it just something that people took for granted? She had made a sacrifice, returned something that didn't belong to her, and in doing so had hoped for some recognition or reward, even if that reward was just the feeling of being seen. But there was nothing. She leaned back in her chair and stared at the ceiling. It was a familiar feeling, the sense of being invisible, of putting in the effort only to see it go unnoticed. As a single mother, she had learned to expect little from the world. Life had a way of taking and never giving back in equal measure. She had learned to adjust, to adapt to a world that often seemed to ignore the quiet, honest struggles of those who were just trying to make it through the day. But something about this, about returning the wallet, had stung. Why had she bothered? What had she hoped for? Her thoughts were interrupted by the sudden sound of the bell ringing in the bookstore. She stood up quickly, moving to greet the customer, trying to push the lingering thoughts to the back of her mind. It was a quiet morning at the shop, the usual hum of activity much slower than usual, the kind of slow day that made time feel endless. She walked out from behind the counter, ready to offer her usual polite smile, but stopped short when she saw who had walked through the door. Carter. Blake. For a moment, Ella was frozen. She couldn't have been more surprised to see him here, in this small bookstore in the heart of the city. He stood in the doorway, his coat damp from the rain, his eyes scanning the room, looking as out of place as a lion in a pet shop. The man she had given the wallet to. The man whose identity she had only learned the day before. The same man whose wealth and status had seemed so far removed from her own life. Yet here he was, standing in front of her as if he belonged. The silence between them hung in the air like an unspoken question. His presence was unexpected, and, for a moment, Ella wasn't sure what to say or do. She had spent the entire morning feeling conflicted about the kindness she had shown him, questioning whether it had mattered. And now he was here. But why? "I didn't expect to find you here," he said, his voice softer than she remembered. There was something in his tone, something almost vulnerable, that made Ella take a step back. "Are you looking for something?" Ella asked, her voice steady but with a trace of hesitation. It was a question she would ask any customer, but the weight of it now felt different. The air between them had shifted. There was something in his eyes, something raw and unguarded, that made her wonder what this encounter would really mean. He stepped further into the store, his gaze never leaving hers. "No, not really. I'm looking for you." Ella blinked, unsure if she had heard him correctly. "Me?" she repeated, her heart inexplicably speeding up. She had never expected him to show up here, especially not with the same level of intensity that he had in the office. What could he possibly want from her now? She had returned his wallet, and that should have been the end of it. But there he was, standing in front of her like someone searching for something they had lost. "I've been thinking about what you said," Carter continued, his eyes sincere but tinged with something she couldn't quite place. "About doing the right thing even when no one notices. About how you didn't take the money, didn't ask for anything in return. You just gave. And that made me think. I've spent my whole life surrounded by people who only want something from me. And you, when I met you, you didn't want anything from me. You didn't even know who I was. And that's..." He faltered for a moment, his expression softening. "That's something I don't know how to explain." Ella stood still, her mind racing. She had heard what he said, but she wasn't sure if she could believe it. She had always been wary of people like him, the ones who seemed to have everything, who lived in a world where money and power made the rules. She had spent so long building her own little world, a world where trust was hard to come by, where kindness often went unnoticed. It wasn't that she didn't believe him, but something inside her was telling her not to let her guard down too easily. "You don't know how to explain what?" she asked, her voice quieter now, the question she had kept buried beginning to rise to the surface. She didn't want to let herself be vulnerable to him, but the way he looked at her like he was seeing her for the first time made her feel exposed. "I don't know what it is about you," Carter said, his voice low but steady. "I don't know how to explain it. I didn't expect to meet someone like you, someone who didn't care about my name or my money. You treated me like a person, not a billionaire." Ella took a deep breath, trying to understand what he was saying. It was a world she didn't know, one where people were always looking for something in return, always calculating their next move. She had spent so many years in a world where kindness was often seen as weakness, where honesty was a currency no one seemed to value. "I didn't treat you any differently because of who you are," she said quietly, her gaze not leaving his. "I treated you like I would treat anyone else. You found something that didn't belong to you and I returned it, that's all." Carter's eyes softened, and for the first time Ella saw the weight he had been carrying. He wasn't just a rich man, a CEO of a powerful company. He was someone who had never known true connection. People always saw him as a tool, a source of influence. No one had ever seen him for who he truly was. "I was wrong," he said quietly, his voice full of regret. "I didn't tell you the truth when we first met. I didn't trust you enough to show you who I really am." Ella's heart clenched as she looked at him. The vulnerability in his words, the honesty that was so rare in the world she lived in, struck a chord deep within her. She had lived her whole life trying to protect herself, trying not to give too much, because the world had taught her that it wasn't worth it. But here he was, standing in front of her, offering his truth, his vulnerability, in a way she hadn't expected. "I didn't know how to trust anyone," Carter continued, his eyes searching hers. "I've spent my life building walls around myself. I've hidden who I am because I thought that's what I needed to do. But you've shown me that maybe, just maybe, I've been doing it all wrong." Ella felt a lump form in her throat. She wanted to believe him. She wanted to believe that this was the beginning of something real, something honest, something worth fighting for. But it wasn't that easy. She couldn't just throw away all the lessons life had taught her. She couldn't ignore the reality of who he was. Could she trust him? Could she trust herself enough to let him in? You don't need to explain, Ella said softly, her voice filled with a quiet strength. You've already said enough. And for the first time in their conversation, Carter Blake smiled, a smile that reached his eyes, a smile that felt genuine, that felt real. Then let me show you the real me, he said, his voice filled with determination. I don't want to hide anymore. Ella didn't answer right away, but the truth was, she had already begun to believe him. Ella's life had always been one of quiet resilience, a daily grind of navigating the complexities of raising her daughter, managing her modest bookstore, and trying to maintain some semblance of a personal life amidst the noise of a world that seemed to move faster than she could keep up with. For so long, she had been content with the familiar routine, the small joys that kept her going. Her daughter's laughter, the feel of a good book in her hands, the occasional cup of coffee shared with a friend. But then came the moment with the wallet and the subsequent message from Blake Tech, which turned her world in a direction she had never anticipated. As she sat at her small kitchen table the morning after returning the wallet, the reality of what had just occurred began to sink in. She had acted out of instinct, of principle, but now that the dust had settled, the repercussions were still unclear. She had been told to drop off the wallet at a high-rise office building in Midtown. The envelope they gave her in exchange felt hollow. No warmth, no real appreciation, just the cold formality of a transaction. The email they sent her had felt like a mechanical response, and there was nothing about it that said thank you or we see you. She had almost discarded it too, this gesture that seemed as if it were meant to placate her rather than genuinely acknowledge her actions. And yet something inside her couldn't let it go. Days passed, and though she had resumed her usual rhythm of work at the bookstore, she found her mind drifting back to the moment she handed over the wallet. The weight of it, the choice she had made. She had acted from a place of integrity, but in a world that often felt indifferent to such gestures, was it enough? Was it even worth it? She thought about the people in her life who had failed her, the ones who had taken and never given back. There was so much in her own life she felt she hadn't been given. A little recognition, a little kindness, a little care in a world that had always demanded more than she had. But despite it all, she knew one thing for certain. She would never compromise her values, not for anyone, not for anything. Her thoughts were interrupted when the bell above the bookstore door chimed, signaling a customer's arrival. Ella glanced up expecting a regular, someone who came in for a quiet browse, maybe a cup of coffee. But when her eyes met the man who walked through the door, her heart skipped a beat. It was him. Carter Blake. She didn't know what she had expected when she had handed over the wallet, but it certainly wasn't this. She had returned a lost item, a simple act of kindness, and in the process she had made a small mark on his life. But now here he was standing in the middle of her bookstore, looking like he had just stepped out of a world so different from hers. His polished shoes clicked against the wooden floor, his coat still damp from the rain outside, but it wasn't the weather or his high-end suit that caught her attention. It was the expression on his face, almost hesitant, almost vulnerable. Ella, Carter said softly, his voice carrying an unfamiliar weight. I didn't expect to find you here. She swallowed, still trying to process his presence. I didn't expect you to come here, she said, the words slipping out before she could stop them. She instantly regretted the bluntness, but Carter didn't seem to mind. I needed to see you, he said, his voice quiet but firm. There's something I need to say to you. Ella felt a wave of confusion and curiosity wash over her. What could he possibly want now? She had returned his wallet, done what was right, and yet here he was standing in front of her like she was the only thing on his mind. He looked at her with an intensity that made her uneasy, yet she couldn't look away. Can I help you? With something? Ella asked, trying to keep her tone neutral, but inside her mind was racing. This wasn't just another customer. It couldn't be. There was something more here. Something that felt like it was about to unfold in a way neither of them had anticipated. Carter took a step closer, as though drawn by some invisible force. His eyes, which had always seemed so distant and guarded, were now full of something else, something deeper, more real. You don't understand, Ella, he said, his voice low and tinged with emotion. I didn't just lose a wallet, I lost something I didn't even know I had. You showed me that. That's why I'm here. Ella blinked, struggling to comprehend what he was saying. She wasn't sure if this was some grand gesture or just another attempt to make himself feel better. She had seen it before. The wealthy, Powerful people who thought they could fix everything with a smile or a show of generosity. But there was something different about Carter. She could see it now in the way he spoke, the way he looked at her, as if he wasn't just speaking to her as a CEO or a millionaire, but as a man, vulnerable and searching for something more than the surface of things. "I don't understand," she admitted, her voice soft. "What do you mean?" He took a deep breath, looking away for a moment as though gathering his thoughts. "I've spent my whole life building walls," he said, almost as if to himself. "Walls around my heart, walls around my life. I've been so afraid of being seen for who I really am. So afraid that if people saw me for who I was, they would take advantage of me. But when I met you, when I saw how you acted, how you didn't ask for anything, how you returned my wallet without hesitation, I realized something. You didn't see me as a billionaire. You saw me as a person. That's rare, and I don't know what to do with it." Ella felt a knot form in her stomach. It was one thing to hear someone speak with such vulnerability in a private conversation, but to have a man like Carter Blake, someone who could have anything and anyone, stand here in front of her, admitting his fears and weaknesses, felt surreal. He was the last person she had expected to open up to her like this. The last person she expected to feel anything remotely close to self-doubt. "I'm not a perfect person," Carter continued, his eyes searching hers. "I've been wrong about so many things. I've been wrong about the way I've treated people, the way I've lived my life, the way I've used my wealth. But you?" He stopped himself, taking a long, slow breath. "You didn't need any of that to see me, and it's been eating at me. I don't know how to explain it, but I need to be real with you. I need to be real with myself." Ella stood there, feeling a mixture of emotions swirl inside her. She had no idea how to respond to this, how to process what he was saying. He was Carter Blake, the CEO of Blake Tech, a man whose name was synonymous with success, and yet here he was, standing in front of her like a man who had lost his way. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The bookstore was quiet except for the soft ticking of the clock on the wall, the occasional rustle of a page turning, the hum of life, outside the walls of this small, inconspicuous shop. Finally, Ella spoke, her voice softer now, almost hesitant. "I didn't return your wallet because of who you are. I did it because it was the right thing to do. I didn't expect anything in return, Carter. I didn't even want anything. But what I need to know is, do you really understand that? Do you understand that doing the right thing isn't about what you get in return? It's about what you give. And for once, I need someone to show me that they understand that." Carter looked at her, his expression shifting as though the weight of her words had finally broken through the walls he had built around himself. "I understand," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm sorry for not seeing it before, but I see it now. I see you." And in that moment, Ella realized that sometimes the world did give back, just not in the way she had expected. It wasn't about receiving recognition or praise. It wasn't about getting something in return for every act of goodness. Sometimes, doing the right thing meant simply being seen for who you truly were. Ella had never been one for grand gestures or flashy displays. Her life was quiet, contained, and as simple as she could make it. She had learned early on that kindness didn't always come with applause, and doing the right thing was often its own reward. But even the strongest among us had their limits. Even someone like her, who had spent most of her life weathering storms and never asking for anything, couldn't help but feel the sting of being overlooked. She had done what she thought was right, returning Carter Blake's wallet without hesitation. She didn't expect anything in return, except maybe a little recognition. But what had she gotten in exchange? A few cold words in an email, a formality at best. But now, as she stood in her bookstore, watching Carter Blake, of all people, walking toward her, something inside her shifted. He wasn't like any of the customers who strolled into her shop, looking for a quick purchase or a hot cup of coffee. No, he was something different, something she hadn't expected to meet. He was both the man who could buy anything and anyone, but somehow standing in front of her, he seemed small, vulnerable, as if he were a man unmoored, seeking something in a world he had never been able to find. His presence in her bookstore felt like the soft echo of a storm passing through, a quiet aftershock that vibrated against the walls of her carefully constructed life. He looked at her as if he had been looking for her his entire life. She didn't know how to feel about that. Part of her wanted to turn away, to shut herself off again, to preserve the walls she'd spent years building. But another part of her, one that she hadn't known was still alive, wanted to reach out, to see if there was anything genuine left in a world so often defined by appearances and expectations. "You didn't have to come here," she said, softly, trying to mask the wariness in her voice. Her hands were trembling slightly, the way they always did when something unexpected happened. "I know," Carter replied quietly, his eyes never leaving hers. "But I needed to. There's something I've been wanting to say to you, something I can't ignore anymore." Ella paused, wondering where this would go. She had already heard his words in their previous conversation. He had apologized for his silence, for the way he had hidden behind the walls of his wealth and status. But now, standing in front of him, it was clear that he wasn't just speaking out of some sense of guilt or obligation. There was something else, something deeper in his gaze, something that pulled at her in a way she wasn't prepared for. "I've been thinking about that night," he continued, his voice slightly hushed, as if speaking any louder might break the fragile atmosphere between them. "About you. About how you returned my wallet. How you didn't even hesitate. And it made me realize something." He paused, his fingers nervously running through his hair, a movement that caught Ella off guard. It was the first sign of vulnerability he had shown since meeting her. "Real people don't care about money," he said, the words coming slowly, as if he were tasting each one for the first time. "You didn't want anything from me. You didn't want any acknowledgement, any reward. You just did the right thing. And for the first time in my life, I realized that maybe that's what I've been missing. Real connections. Real people. I don't know how to explain it, but meeting you has changed everything for me." Ella swallowed, feeling a flutter in her chest. She wasn't sure how to process his words. Her mind wanted to shut him out, wanted to protect herself from whatever this might be. But her heart, against her better judgment, was listening. She had spent so much of her life believing that doing the right thing meant nothing in the grand scheme of things. But Carter's words, his openness, made her feel as though she had been wrong all along. "You're not the first person to talk to me like this," Ella said, her voice steady but her eyes betraying the vulnerability she wasn't ready to show. "I've had people try to buy my trust before. I've had people tell me they see the real me, only to disappear when the novelty wore off. I can't afford to let my guard down easily. Not anymore." Carter's face softened. He stepped closer, and for a moment it felt as though the world outside the bookstore had disappeared. There was nothing left but the two of them in this small, quiet space. "I'm not asking for your trust," Carter said, his voice gentle. "I'm asking for a chance to prove to you that I can be real, that I can be the person you deserve." Ella felt the words sink into her like a slow building tide. She wasn't sure what it was that made her listen to him. Maybe it was the sincerity in his eyes, the rawness of his voice, or maybe it was just that for once someone wasn't offering her something because they wanted something in return. But no matter the reason, she found herself stepping toward him just a little, unsure of the path ahead but unwilling to walk away without understanding it. "You've been living in a world that doesn't see you for who you are," Ella said, quietly, her voice thick with a truth she had never shared with anyone else. "I understand that. But you can't keep hiding behind who you think people want you to be. You can't live like that forever." Carter didn't answer at first, but the shift in his expression was enough. The walls he had so carefully constructed began to crumble in front of her. His breath, shallow and shaky, caught as he took a step closer. "I know," he said softly, "and I'm sorry. I've been afraid for so long, afraid of being seen for who I really am. But I'm tired of hiding. I'm tired of pretending I'm someone I'm not. You make me feel like I don't have to be that person anymore. Like I can be someone who does the right thing, no matter the consequences." Ella looked at him, her heart pounding in her chest. The vulnerability in his words, the rawness of his emotions, struck her in a way she hadn't expected. She had always believed that vulnerability was a weakness, something to be protected against. But Carter, in this moment, was showing her that it could be a strength, a bridge between two people who had both suffered in their own ways. "I'm not asking for you to fix me," Carter continued, his voice thick with emotion. "I just want to be real. I want to build something with you. Something that's not based on pretense or expectation, but on honesty. And I don't know if you can ever forgive me for what I did, but I have to try." Ella felt the weight of his words settle over her, and for the first time in a long time she felt herself exhale, as if a burden she hadn't known she was carrying had finally been lifted. "I'm not sure what this is," Ella said softly, her voice barely a whisper. "But I'm willing to see where it goes." I've spent too much time running from things, from people, from feelings. Maybe it's time I stop." Carter smiled. A small tentative smile, but a smile nonetheless. And in that moment, Ella realized that sometimes the things we run from, the things we fear the most, are the very things we need to face in order to move forward. As they stood there, two strangers brought together by a simple act of kindness, Ella knew this was the beginning of something neither of them could predict. But it was real. It was honest. And for the first time in a long time, that was enough. Ella never expected her life to change so drastically from a single act of honesty. Returning the wallet had been something she'd done without much thought, an instinct more than anything else. She didn't expect to be thanked, nor did she anticipate any great acknowledgement. But the unexpected series of events that followed had started to unravel a life she had carefully stitched together. There was something about Carter Blake's presence in her world that left her feeling exposed, yet also filled with a quiet hope that she hadn't known she'd been searching for. It had taken a while for the full weight of their conversations to sink in. At first, Carter's vulnerability had taken her by surprise. She had never encountered someone so honest about their struggles, especially someone of his stature. But over time, as they continued to speak, as the layers between them began to peel away, Ella found herself confronting emotions she had spent years burying deep within. It wasn't just about Carter anymore. It was about her too. About learning to trust, to allow herself to be seen for who she truly was, not just as a mother, a worker, or someone who had to hold it all together at all times. Their relationship was slow, measured, and perhaps it needed to be. After all, trust was something that had to be earned, and Ella wasn't the type to give it away easily. But in Carter, she saw someone who was trying, not to fix her, not to save her, but to be someone who was willing to be real, someone who was willing to expose his vulnerabilities. That in itself was more valuable than any grand gesture. Few weeks after their honest exchange, Carter had invited her to dinner, a casual affair, no reporters, no cameras, just them. They were learning to navigate their way through this unexpected connection, feeling each other out in the most genuine way they could. Ella had agreed, not knowing exactly what she was walking into, but with a sense of hope in her heart. She felt lighter than she had in years, despite the tension in the air. She didn't know where this was going, and part of her wasn't sure if she even wanted to know. All she knew was that, for the first time in a long time, she felt like someone saw her for who she was, not for what she could do for them. The evening arrived, and Ella found herself standing in front of her mirror, adjusting the collar of her coat, unsure of what to expect. She wasn't the type to dress up for anything other than the occasional work event or family gathering. The idea of a date, however informal, felt unfamiliar. She wasn't sure if she was ready for the feelings that seemed to rise and fall within her, but she didn't allow herself to back out. For once, she decided to let go of her usual guard. She arrived at the small, intimate cafe Carter had chosen. The place was quiet, warm and inviting, a far cry from the corporate meetings and boardrooms she imagined Carter often frequented. The atmosphere was personal, and there, amidst the soft lighting and the hum of gentle conversation, Carter stood, waiting for her. He was wearing a simple sweater and jeans, no hint of the businessman who had once appeared so intimidating to her. In that moment, she saw only a man who was trying to make something real out of a world that often seemed too polished, too transactional. "Hey," he said when he saw her approach. His smile was genuine, his eyes soft in the way they hadn't been before. "Hi," Ella replied, her voice a little shaky. She felt out of place in a world she had never truly belonged to, but somehow this small moment, this dinner, felt like a beginning. She smiled back, taking a seat across from him at the cozy table by the window. The conversation flowed easily that evening. There were no awkward pauses or forced pleasantries, only the kind of ease that came with two people willing to listen, to understand each other. They talked about books, about the mundane details of life, about the small joys and pains that came with being alive. It was the first time in a long while that Ella had let herself relax, not thinking about the next thing, not worrying about what needed to be done, just living in the present. Carter was right there with her, meeting her in the present moment, without any pretense. As the evening wore on, Ella felt herself letting go of the reservations she had carried for so long. This wasn't just a dinner. It was a shift in her life, a small step toward embracing something she had once thought impossible: trust, connection, real intimacy. Not the kind that came with obligation or expectation, but the kind that grew out of honesty, out of vulnerability. After dinner, they walked out into the crisp night air, the streetlights casting soft halos over the sidewalk. Carter's hand brushed against hers and she froze, unsure of what to do. But before she could pull away, he gently took her hand in his. For a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. It wasn't a grand gesture, but it was enough. Enough to remind her that she wasn't alone, that someone was here with her, walking beside her in this strange new world they were building, together. They stopped at the corner, and Carter turned to face her, his gaze soft, almost uncertain. "Ella, I know I'm not the easiest person to understand," he began, his voice thick with emotion. "I've spent so much of my life running away from real connections, building walls to keep people out. But with you, I don't want to do that anymore. I don't want to hide behind who I think I should be. I just want to be me with you." Ella's heart skipped a beat. She wasn't sure what it meant, what this moment could lead to. But she knew that something had shifted between them. Something that couldn't be taken back. "I'm still figuring it out," he continued, squeezing her hand gently. "But I know one thing. I don't want to do this without you. Whatever this is." Ella's breath caught in her throat. She wasn't used to hearing words like these, not in a world where actions often spoke louder than words and where promises were broken more often than they were kept. But Carter's voice, so steady and honest, made her believe, if only for a moment, that maybe, just maybe, there was more to this life than what she had always known. "I'm not asking for you to fix me," Carter said, almost as if reading her mind. "I'm not perfect, and I don't expect you to save me. But I do want to be real. With you." Ella looked at him, really looked at him, for the first time without the mask of her own fears and doubts. I'm not asking for perfection either," she said quietly. "But I think, no, I know. I can give you something real, and maybe together we can figure out the rest." Carter smiled then, a soft, genuine smile that reached his eyes. And in that moment, as the world continued to rush by, as the city lights flickered in the distance, Ella knew that whatever happened next, whether it was easy or hard, joyful or painful, they would face it together. She didn't know where this would lead, but for the first time she was willing to find out. She didn't need grand gestures, and neither did he. What they needed was each other, and that was enough. And so in the quiet of the evening, as the rain began to fall softly around them, they stood there, hands intertwined, knowing that they had found something real, something worth fighting for. The key takeaway from this story is the power of doing the right thing without expecting anything in return. In a world where we often feel unseen, it's important to remember that our actions, no matter how small, shape the life we live and the connections we make. By embracing honesty and vulnerability, we can build deeper, more meaningful relationships. What do you think is the most important lesson from Ella and Carter's story? A. Always expect something in return for your kindness. B. True connection is built on honesty and vulnerability. Comment your answer below and share your thoughts on the story. What did it teach you? Don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more inspiring content.